Hello, Carmine. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, Mike. Good to be back.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we spoke the other week about an article that you posted on your blog, tpack.com, about the origins of violence, and you listed fear, disgust, and status as three of the main reasons there's violence or people engage in it. And we kind of did an overview. We thought today we might get into one of these ones in specifics. And
Yeah, yeah. I thought we could jump into fear and discuss the role. And it's not to say that I think that these are the only three things that drive violence. There's lots of things that drive violence, but these are three of the more, I would contend, primordial drivers in us that makes us seek out certain behaviors. It just seems to always play out a certain way when one of these three things gets involved that leads to violence. Fear, I think, is obvious in some ways, and some ways it's more complex, and we might not understand the depth that fear can drive us. But it can be as simple as a wild animal. Most people are going to be afraid of a wild animal, especially if that animal is dangerous, if it's large, if it can kill them, if it's a predator. Everyone might think that sharks are really interesting until you get into shark-infested waters and you get a cut. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh no, well, I mean, it's obvious fear in a certain sense, and because if there is something scary like a shark and you're swimming in the ocean, you got a lot of reason to be scared. And if I was in such a situation and had an implement to do damage to the shark, I would do it. And someone might say that's violence,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you're
It's
all
what I was just going to say. Yeah, it's it's an elemental feeling in us. We have a basic, and that's the thing I think we have to demonstrate between the two. It's violence isn't always bad. There is defensive violence, which everyone at some point in their life will likely have to employ, whether it's someone trying to beat you up, or it's an assailant trying to rob you, or it's a car coming at you. I mean, there's all sorts of violence you might have to undertake to save yourself, and that's why it exists on that normal plane. The problem is when fear gets involved, we can overestimate the danger because of the fear, or we can take much greater retaliatory action than we normally would if we were not afraid.
so. In other words, the shark is a pretty simple situation. It's pretty obvious why one would be afraid, but you're implying that there are times when we're fearful when the dangers aren't as great as they seem,
Yeah,
or we don't even understand we're being fearful.
yeah. We might attribute it to something else and make it so imminent. For instance, let's say that uh, wherever you might work at your job, there's another person who is new to the job. You don't really know them. You don't really know their intentions. You don't know much about them. And let's say that they are hired into a position that you wanted. So there's going to be an automatic perception that this person might be a threat to you, a danger to you, and a danger to you getting farther in the company. They've already taken away this job you wanted. What else are they going to do? So you have an intrinsic fear of what threat they might present. Even if they don't, they could be the nicest person in the world. But because of circumstance, they've taken that place, and now, whether or not you will recognize it as fear, you are fearful of what they might do, fearful if they might affect your trajectory again.
Well, I think a year or two ago, I was in a city, um, and uh, I was walking somewhere, and I was in a bad area though, and these two guys were coming, and I kept my distance from them, and they stopped and they asked for money, and one of them told me they just got out of jail, which was strange. I mean, I knew it was just a weird situation, but I deliberately kept my distance from them, and I watched their hands just in case one of them pulled something out.
Yeah.
Uh, and And then here several months ago, I was walking uh, in a park, but it was like it's a trail, and there's rarely anyone on it, and there's no shady people or anything. But I walked up to an area where somebody, I could tell they had gotten off their bicycle. They're riding a bike, and they went. It looked like I think they went in the woods, to go to the bathroom or something. But they were in an area that they were cornered, um, and I was sort of, I could scare them. I didn't want to startle them, so I made it clear to them that I was a person in the area, and I kept my distance from the person. I didn't walk up and get up on him, when he
Yeah.
came out of the woods. And that's something that I try to do. If there's someone you don't know, you don't just get right up on them, especially in an area where I live in, where there are actually a lot of people that carry concealed guns.
Well, and there are several. That's probably a legitimate, reasonable use of fear. You know what I mean? You have legitimate reasons to, and it's also you're being polite. There's also an amount of politeness to trying to realize other people's, you know, uh, their space, their limitations, especially if you think he might be in a compromised position. He's snuck off to go to the bathroom on the side. You want him to know that you're there so he doesn't freak out and attack you if you accidentally walk into an area he's around. So, yeah, that makes sense. And I think the problem is that when people, and the same with those, the people that you encountered where the one guy said that he had just got out of jail, you had reasonable expectation to be fearful or at least to be on edge around those people. I mean, he gave you one by saying, yeah, I just got out. So that makes you think, oh, okay, did you kill somebody? Are you threatening me? Is that like to make me give you my money? Or, there's lots of reasonable places you can go from there. The problem is that when people can attach that one instance, let's say, to whomever those people were, and then in future instances that fear carries on. And there's actually, I was reading one study where they were talking about the idea of something called a fear network, where it can become, because normally when we have memories, even based on fear, they're hot and cold memories. Most of our memories are cold, and the hot memories give you the flashes of emotion and some of the context of how you were feeling at the time and things like that. But if you're too fearful, it can then have later triggers where it has absolutely nothing to do with the original fear event, but it makes you fearful in the future, like you were in the original event. So the problem is it can get out of hand. People can, if you're afraid of something for too long, too many times, it starts to kind of like with violence. You require a lower and lower threshold over time to where you could be getting irrationally fearful about nothing just because it has some sort of vague attachment to what the original source of fear was.
Well, you write in your article that there's 3 responses to fear: fight, flight, and the flight one was what I was getting ready to do, keep my distance from these 2 guys in case one of them pulled a knife out. I wasn't going to fight some guy with a knife. I was going to turn around and run.
Well, there's 2 of them. Yeah, so you're at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and I thought I could outrun them. But anyway, the third one is freeze. So how does freeze help someone who's scared?
Unfortunately, freeze doesn't.
Oh.
I'm sure that there might be experts that might disagree, and maybe there are maybe some predators won't attack you if you play dead. I mean, I guess that would be a good freeze response. So it can be useful, I guess, in that way, that you can play dead like possum, or you can attempt to, with bears, they say you should try to do that if you have no means of escape, that you should play dead so they'll stop attacking you, because sometimes they'll actually leave a dead thing alone if you don't smell like food or they're not hungry, I guess. But freeze for humans is not a good one unless it's freeze maybe if you're hiding and you just go, you're totally still and you make no noise whatsoever. Maybe freeze can work for you there. But if you're in the open and you freeze, you're basically a target. You're a standing target. As where fight and flight makes sense. Fight, you try to encounter, you try to engage the threat and neutralize it. Flight, you try to escape the threat and live another day. But freeze, unless you're in the right position, freeze is just you're basically giving up.
Well, actually, maybe one. I mean, now think about it. I mean, in one case, it might make sense, and that is not if it's a person, but a dog or something. Because you don't really want to run, I don't think.
Yeah.
But you freezing is, I would say, just pausing and getting ready to fight.
Well, yeah.
But you can't run.
If it's a momentary freeze, I understand. But if you just lock up, like as we
Yeah.
were talking about earlier with those goats that'll fall over unconscious when they get
Yeah.
scared, then you're
You're in trouble.
you're food.
But I wonder what causes that.
Well, I think it's all involuntary responses. It's the same thing that would make you fight or flight. I would think that, there's the environmental circumstances, and then there's just the intrinsic personality of the creature. Or
Well, maybe this is what happens because I'm reading some of your stuff in here. You talk about storms and lightning and tornadoes. Maybe this is what happens to two people where I live. In my county, they died last year. It's not funny, but it's crazy. They died because it rained a foot in like an hour. It was awful. This hurricane came and hit Florida and went all inland, all the way up to where I live, and it rained a foot. And a couple people, two people drove their cars into flooded roadways and drowned in their car. But maybe that's the freeze response at work, because they didn't stop, they didn't turn around, they just kept going.
Yeah, or they didn't get out.
Well,
if you realize that, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, if you floor it into it, sure, then. But personally, I wouldn't suggest that people floor their car into large amounts of water because cars can't swim.
Well, the big problem nowadays with flooding in cars is so many of these cars are electronic and they got their computers, and you get in the water and it shortens it out, so you can't operate the
oh yeah,
door.
well, yeah, I have an older car.
You're just screwed. You can't operate. You can't open the door up because your computer's broke.
Yeah, that's crazy. There needs to be an escape system in those cars. Then there needs to be a way to bash the window out or
something.
Yeah, that's. I mean, yeah, in that situation, I suppose maybe that's what would explain it. But it surprises me when I hear about things like that, because I understand, a freezing death, a fire death, a disaster death. In a hurricane, you get hit by, or a tornado, something like that. But if you're consciously driving into the water, I mean, you would think if you have an electronic car, you would realize that submerging it in water will damage it and probably render it useless.
Yeah.
I guess.
Their brain. I mean, I should stop talking about it, because now someone's going to listen to this that knows one of these people, and it's just not good.
Well, and I'm sorry that they died, but it's just you have to make. There are some things you should know about your vehicle if you're going to go out in bad weather, and one of them is if it's going to lock up if you drive in flooded waters when you're having flooding. So yeah, I personally don't even understand why they were on the road. If a hurricane was hitting at the time, I mean, if they're going to the hospital, then I'm very sorry it happened. But unless it was a need, I don't know why we've gotten sidetracked. But anyway, but you know what? It goes into fear.
And it does.
And I think their decision was probably made as if it was a fearful decision that brought them out that night, or that made them drive through that puddle or not puddle, but huge amount of water when they most likely shouldn't have gone out in the first. I don't think anybody should have. I wouldn't. Everyone can make their own decisions, but it's probably a bad idea to go out into a hurricane unless you have to.
Yeah, it's bad. This friend of mine, Dave Scarica, lives in the Bahamas, and he saw this. He was driving somewhere, but he realized he can't go much farther when he went up to a bridge that has waves and waves 50 feet tall going over it. He said, well, I can't go over that. And some woman decided to try to do it, and her car got thrown into the ocean. So anyway, I keep going on this thing.
Yeah.
But you talk. Yeah, I mean, this is.
Well, and once
you're
again,
talking a lot, tribal and more violence, and how is fear connected to violence, not just driving your car silly.
well, and as you just made with the example with Dave, his fear served him well.
Yeah.
That lady, her fear did not serve her so well.
Yeah, so in a certain sense, fear can be useful then.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, it's set up as a defense mechanism. Unfortunately, it can go wrong, and we can become, like what happened with Dave is probably something along the lines of conditioned fear, because he got the negative. Chances are he had seen bad things happen with water before, because he was in that area. So he became conditioned to, he needed to be very careful, that water was very dangerous, that the weather could destroy things, and that, he shouldn't try to challenge it. As where the other person either wasn't from that area, or
yeah, she could have been a tourist.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah, or just, didn't have a healthy fear. And I've said this too when we've talked about, another example of healthy fear too is like conditioned fear with children. People might say that it's not nice that you tell children negative things or that you correct their behavior, but you have to if you want them to become well-adjusted adults. You can't just let someone do whatever they want. There has to be negative consequences, and that's a useful use of fear. They're afraid to do those bad things again. Now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, and with, and like abusive people, of course, would be taking that too far. And that's why you get mental illness and you get violence in children and, people acting out because the fear.
Well, I think, right.
You think you were saying?
It's interesting. I'm going to try to use an example of how ultimate violence, more than anyone can imagine, and the fear. You try to make a really extreme example of this, how it can be so under the surface that it is seemingly irrational.
Yeah.
It's not, may not be readily apparent that's what's going on. But both of us are interested in history and in Kennedy and all kinds and things like that. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they had an argument over what to do. Should they do a war against Cuba? How big of a war should they do a blockade and so forth? And there was one key meeting where this was really argued out, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, General Taylor, and he wasn't as extreme as like General LeMay and some of the others, but he said if they don't use bombs against Cuba, that their entire defense doctrine would then not be in practice. So therefore he advocated bombing. And General LeMay made a statement during this time in a meeting with just the Joint Chiefs of Staff that if they don't use, in this case, if they're not willing to use nuclear weapons, then they're wasting the $50 billion a year they're spending on them. So these are people that were at the top of bureaucracies, and their jobs and personhood is all tied up in this. And I think that's what they're really scared of. And they were willing to engage in mass violence over it.
Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, and we see that we see Richard Nixon in his private meetings with Kissinger talking about that he was willing to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam. We see Taylor trying to advise LBJ to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam. We see Truman talking about bombing other places. besides Japan. Just the two cities we hit in Japan. I mean, we saw generals floating, hitting other places. Yeah, there are, and it's not just America. There's plenty. The Russians almost launched a few times. If it was actually, I think in one of the instances in the 80s, they didn't launch because one of their own technicians decided not to send things onto the Kremlin. He realized it was a technical error, that the Americans weren't actually launching, that something was malfunctioning. So he just didn't send the information. So it's actually come down to single people sometimes that have saved the world from nuclear war. And it's all based on fear. You know, the entire nuclear threat is a fear-driven threat. No one, I would imagine, that's rational would ever want to use them. But it's the threat of using them that drives so much diplomacy. And like you were saying, I mean, it's the fear, that fear that was in LeMay is the same fear that is now in Putin. It's the same fear that is now in some of our military leaders in the United States that want to reignite a second Cold War. It's a lot of things are driven on fear, and they invest themselves personally, like you said, which makes an even bigger problem because then they're.
But I think is interesting. I think one thing interesting about it is that none of these people are themselves in physical danger. So
no,
this gets us away from the idea, of animals or muggers or whatever. And this is also
existential fear.
Yeah.
And that's where it becomes a danger. It's kind of like when we get into another show and we talk about disgust, the differences between useful disgust from disease and bad smells and moral disgust. With fear, it's the same thing. There's the useful, beneficial, intrinsic dangers that we should be fearful of, and there are even social fears that are useful. Like with shame, I've had many arguments with people about, and stop me if I go too long, because I know we don't want to make it too long for people to listen to. But with shame, that's another useful driver within humans that people have been trying to basically throw to the wayside and destroy and demonize. But shame is useful. When you feel shame, sometimes it's because you should. You do something shameful. It doesn't all have to be, the parents from Footloose.
Right.
Sometimes you just do something bad and you should feel bad about it.
So you don't do it again.
That. Yeah, exactly. And that's conditioning. That's another part of the thing with fear.
Well, some of this stuff is inspired by the book that you have coming out
Human
in
Time.
February.
Yeah.
Right. And I suggest people, I've read it, of course, and I suggest people grab a copy of it and pre-order it now. That way you don't have to worry about forgetting about it and then not getting it in February. Just put the pre-order in. Because it's really good and interesting. And what we're talking about here just touches the surface of the bigger topics that are in that book.
Yeah. It's called Human Time Bomb, The Violence Within Our Nature. And as Mike said, it'll be available in February. And I truly appreciate it if you picked one up and had a look at it. And I think some of it it's very important material. We'll continue, in future shows to talk about some of the other. I think there's a lot of references, not just historical, but to modern problems that we're suffering right now that we need to address. And I think fear is playing a big, you name the aspect of life, whether it's, the clash of, fear between the generations, whether it's the amount of depression and, the rampant mental illness that's been going on. There's a lot of fear in our society, and I don't think it's all necessary. So.
For sure. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to me and my listeners, and we'll definitely talk again soon.
Okay, thanks for having me. Talk to you soon, Mike.